Thank you. My name is Mary Kay Quinlan. I teach in the College of Journalism, and my colleague Mary Garbatz and I were asked to be bumblebees, I guess, floating around to the various open space groups that were self-identified around questions that individuals in the hall wanted to explore. And a total of 33 different groups over 2 sessions addressed those issues. The themes that emerged really can be categorized in a couple of different ways, I think. The overarching theme, I think there was one overarching theme and a couple of overarching challenges, and then a couple of general comments that recurred enough that we think it's important to mention. So first of all, the overarching theme very clearly was an emphasis on inclusiveness. And there was a sense expressed among some participants that the inclusiveness should go farther than what has been seen here in this conference. So for example, one of the recommendations from a group was that the Rural Futures Institute have an active youth advisory board, and that would play an important role. There was also concern expressed that agriculture per se was not at the table during this conference as much as it perhaps could have been or should have been, and that that would be an important piece of the Rural Futures Institute as well. Along the same lines, environmental issues and natural resource issues in the largest sense need to be at the table. Water, climate, energy were some of the recurring themes that we heard. Likewise, commodity groups and other non-governmental and volunteer organizations have an important role to play in envisioning a rural future, and that their voices need to have a role. Again, inclusiveness, another sort of category of inclusiveness, is the role that the state colleges and the community colleges and tribal colleges can play in addressing some of these issues, and particularly in reaching underserved groups, which was another inclusiveness issue. And several people also talked about the importance of including other land-grant institutions around the region who share these same concerns. Some people expressed concern that extension educators were not as prominently positioned in some of these discussions as perhaps they could have been, and that in any event, they should have an important role to play in executing any outcomes of the Rural Futures Institute's activities. The final inclusiveness point, I think, is one that that many of us would want to stop and think about a little bit, and that is the emphasis on the importance of welcoming newcomers in a community, whether that newcomer is from Omaha or from halfway around the world. And I think the point was made that this nation, or this part of our nation in particular, has an immigrant heritage. And the tradition of communities growing, becoming vibrant because of their immigrant heritage is one that we ought not forget today. One of the challenges that, or one of the categories of challenges that reoccurred in the discussions has to do with the question of what incentives will there be to get people to do these things that we may all agree need to be done. Whether that is extension educators and redefining their roles, perhaps. There was a sense that because extension educators are so widely dispersed around the state, that there is likely to be an important role for them, and yet how does that add on to what they already do? How do we create incentives for faculty to work in Rural Futures Institute activities or goals and not have that adversely affect their efforts to achieve promotion and tenure, an issue that was recurring. Also, along those same lines, what about the incentives for erasing the disciplinary boundaries, or at least poking holes in those academic silos that have been mentioned any number of times? What will be the incentives to make that happen? And also, the notion that the Rural Futures Institute really needs to incorporate or make use of existing organizations and services that already provide some of the kinds of things that have been talked about throughout the past 3 days. How can those kinds of organizations or services be made part of the Rural Futures Institute structure? Another category of challenges that the open space groups identified has to do with infrastructure in its broadest sense. Housing for both elderly and youth was one issue that emerged. A great deal of discussion about internships and how to create the infrastructure that would make internships happen in all kinds of ways, including internships on the farm for urban people, if that's what they are interested in learning about. The transportation infrastructure in the state, particularly in a state such as ours with great distances and a dispersed population, air service, rail service, and one of the open session participants pointed out that Nebraska is the only state in the country that doesn't have a State Department of Transportation. We have a State Department of Roads. Health and access to health care is another infrastructure issue. Access to health insurance is an infrastructure kind of issue that also affects rural life and raises all kinds of questions that many people, again, are already working on and trying to address. But some of those kinds of problems seem to be intractable. Several people pointed out that the independent nature of rural people themselves and the dispersed nature of population in much of the rural parts of Nebraska makes it difficult for people to organize for political action. And some of the kinds of infrastructure issues that will have to be addressed may in fact require governmental action at the state or perhaps even federal level. And some of those would include things like licensing of healthcare professionals to enable people to practice intermediate level care without supervision in communities. And then the whole issue of access to broadband, high-speed internet service, sort of a key technology issue that I think we all recognize stands in the way of some rural people being able to fully participate in the 21st century economy. And finally, a theme that I guess I've characterized as infrastructure, but you could probably look at it a number of different ways. The importance of marketing rural Nebraska, rural America, in some respects, seems to be stymied by rural people themselves who don't take enough pride in their own self. I'm not sure that was grammatical, but anyway, so that was a notion that too emerged that I think is kind of interesting. Let me just point out two things that we didn't hear as we went around to the various open space groups having their discussions. And for those of you who weren't in that track, I should point out that these groups ranged in size from 3 or 4 people to 15 or 20 people. So it was quite a diverse opportunity for people to let their voices be heard. But through all of that, Mary and I really heard practically no discussion of money. There really weren't people saying, how are we going to pay for this? Neither how are we going to pay for the Institute, but also how are we going to pay for doing all these things that we know need to happen in rural America. So we didn't hear that, and we also didn't hear a discussion of crumbling infrastructure in a more narrow sense of that word, crumbling roads, schools, water systems. There was no discussion that either one of us heard that pertained to those kinds of issues, which we know are in fact issues that affect parts of our state, both rural and urban for that matter. Just two final points that I'd like to make. One is in the category of generalizations about the university that we heard in various groups. It's very clear that extension educators around Nebraska are highly regarded by their friends and neighbors in their counties. They are also seen, however, as stretched very thin in terms of their existing responsibilities, and I think that raises some interesting questions. Another example of positive comments that one hears about the university, the architecture college, which has a new internship program placing architecture students in rural communities attempting to address some of those housing, specific housing needs in a given location, is seen as very positive. Having said that, however, there seemed to be an underlying perception throughout some of the discussions that the university doesn't always see other entities as full and equal players at the table. And that sometimes emerges in such things as the use of obscure language to talk about issues, and the notion of maybe we could be more plain speaking about what we try to do when we engage. Finally, it's important to report that we heard and saw a general recognition that clearly youth are the future of the state. But in some communities, it appears that the old guard, for lack of a better term, is in effect chasing off the youth by an unwillingness to relinquish positions of leadership in the communities, either elected leadership or volunteer organizations, which are the backbone of most rural communities anyway. And so it seems to me that goes beyond perhaps what a Rural Futures Initiative or Rural Futures Institute can directly accomplish, but I think it becomes a challenge for those of us interested in the future of rural communities to think about that issue and think about the kinds of solutions to the problems that presents. That's all I have. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here and report out on the focused conversations that were held as a parallel track to the open space. As planning this conference, we wondered, really how do we engage everyone, but yet really focus on some of the questions that we need to answer as this effort gets underway and the Rural Futures Institute is formed. And so the focus conversations were focused on really how do we make this institute, this Rural Futures, work as an entity. And so we had 10 groups of folks made up of a variety of expertise and geographic areas, and posed 14 questions to them in the areas of culture and philosophical underpinnings of what this could do, support and focus, structure, governance and scope, and general overarching questions. And as we were planning this, one of our questions, we just didn't know how this would all turn out, was how closely the open space questions would mirror what we were asking in the focus conversations. And I really like that Mary went first because they are pretty close. There are some differences, but what I'll do is, I also realized that to the depth of which we were able to talk on these questions, I wasn't going to be able to report to the specifics of those answers. So what I'll do is give kind of, again, the themes and the aha moments from the conversations that were held. One thing that came out and were consistent, it sounded like, from the groups was that this idea that the planets are aligned, and Nebraska has this excellent platform on which to build and address this question. J.B. Milliken mentioned how do you realize what you're getting, kind of a cautionary word. It's like, well, who else? That who else is going to do this? Well, Nebraska is very well positioned, and it was recognized that our administration from the University of Nebraska system is here and engaged and serious about doing this. So that's not the case everywhere, and that was recognized by our out-of-state and international folks that are here to put in their 2 cents. So one of the questions that was posed was this idea that we're facing really complex issues that cannot be solved by one or even a few points of view. So we need to involve our academic experts, field practitioners, community members, research scientists, political leaders, and business owners. They must all be at the table to work together effectively. And to say that is one thing, and to do it is another. So how do we go about doing that? And this theme of respect came out, that folks from the university really need to do their homework when they're engaged with a community, and respect diversity, the youth, women, the groups, model the kind of processes that can get communities engaged. The idea that the university can serve a role as a catalyst and facilitator, but really it's the community, the leadership that is there that needs to be built upon. The idea that working with communities, not on communities, is also part of that question of respect. That it was mentioned, I think Bob mentioned that, is that to study folks, that is something that we can do, but we also have to do it from a collaborative position. In fact, it was suggested that institute is a little too academic for this effort. It doesn't convey what your real intentions are. It should be a Rural Futures Collaborative. And so consider that. We'll just change the name right here. The idea that one of the questions had to do with the civic, lifelong learning, cultural, and artistic life of rural people and places become integral to the rural futures. How do we see that happen? And so they address that question. One of the third is this idea of collaboration, deep and sustained collaboration, and teams, and how do we really facilitate the question of the role of extension as a facilitator, as a catalyst. We have very focused faculty and research that are studying specific things, and so is that the role of extension to really facilitate between these multidisciplinary and things to do? Does extension go beyond, from an administrative standpoint, outside IANR? And so it's easier to engage with our other campuses and UNK and UNO and UNMC. How do we make that work if that's a priority? Trust and accountability must be maintained for the long haul. So if we're going to ask faculty and academics to take risks, how do we create those safe places in which to do that? This idea that there's interconnectedness and interdependency between rural and urban, and both in Nebraska and worldwide. And so how does this institute and this effort address that reality from a physical standpoint, and work on those questions? I better not go in too deep because I'll run out of time. What does success look like, and how are the initial priorities assessed and measured? This idea of, how do we get small, quick successes going on, but actually, because we're really focused on the future and the long term and the global impact of some of these questions, how do we do both? And basically, I think the groups say you have to do both, and so foster those small, quick successes, those short-term successes, but really keep a focus also on the long term. So in regard to structure, governance, and scope, You know, we're picking everyone's brain on organizational structure and those options. How should the Rural Futures priorities be determined and by whom? Criteria, short-term, long-term, balance. How do we incorporate grassroots input? All these questions were posed. And this is, you know, in specific, you'll notice we invited a number of land grant or neighboring land grant universities to participate, and so I'm going to read their question verbatim. It's just so, it says, although the Rural Futures Institute is committed to a broad, inclusive, and diverse set of collaborative partnerships, there is a special historical connection to our land grant brethren in the Great Plains states. And so how do other Great Plains land grants view the Rural Futures effort, what we're undertaking here? What benefits do they see to the region, to their respective states and institutions? What is exciting and what is of concern to the Great Plains lands grants? So we've got their perspective, we're getting this feedback, and this will be compiled and made available to everyone so you could see the details and the depths of the conversations that were held. Some of the overarching questions, and this is critical, and this is something we heard over and over again. How does the Rural Futures effort need to be linked to students in curriculum, research and discovery, and extension and engagement? Again, just how we have to do small and long-term, short and long-term, we need to do all three of engaging students, focusing on research, and then that extension and engagement element. So we have to do these things simultaneously to be successful. How are we going to do that? That's pretty, you know, pretty lofty, but we need to do it. So what are the opportunities and what are the likely points of tension? How do we get prepared to do all these things? How do we really engage the creativity of students? And what is the potential for mentoring, internships, and community engagement? And so this is going to be a real focus. This is one of the great things about this conference, and we'll just build on it, is students, you know, worked seriously, contributed to this conference. So that's very important. Off-campus collaborations and community-based work is new territory to many of the campus-based faculty and staff, but that is an important part of the engagement component of this effort. So how do we increase the level of engagement, and how do we know this is a priority, how do we make it happen? We know full well that other institutions of higher education have launched large and ambitious initiatives that may be somewhat comparable to the Rural Futures. What we're talking about here, they may not focus on rural people or places, but there's this big, we expect universities today to focus on these big ideas and big questions and big issues. And so what can we learn from those other efforts, those successes, their shortcomings? Are there models of best practices? And those were it's like, give us what you know. We were really just writing everything down frantically. What needs to be done differently? How can innovative pilot projects and best practices be taken to scale? And what is most appropriate for doing that? You know, some of these, it was the question of whether some of these competitive grants and the things that come out, can we expect to see pilot programs that really are an evidence of those early successes and efforts of faculty to really get out and work with communities? Are we going to see pilot communities? And last but not least, what are the most important qualities or characteristics that need to be considered when hiring the first director of this effort? What do we need to really lead this effort? It's very important to consider that. So that's how I decided to address the idea that we had 10 groups working on 14 questions in various combinations, is just to give you an overview of what was discussed, what was considered, and the fact that we will compile and have this available to you, and it really will go into the formation of the institute or collaborative or whatever it will now be called as a result of this. So thank you very much, and at this time I'm very pleased to segue into our closing panel, our summary panel, I should say. The end is the beginning of the next phase of how this is developed. So Sam Cordes, please arrive. Here he is. Thank you.